Apparently owning a few too many cars is now a federal offense, at least according to my neighbor Linda, who looked at my driveway like it was a crime scene. First came the glares, then the fake HOA notices, then the cops. All because I rotate my vehicles like a normal person with a job in a garage. She said it disrupted the aesthetic. I say her personality disrupts oxygen flow. And that's not even the juicy part. You'll want to stick around, because what she tried next, it makes petty look professional. Drop a comment. What's the most ridiculous thing a neighbor ever tried to report you for? I promise you, this one ends in a way that'll make you laugh, cheer, and possibly recheck your lease agreement. My name is Marcus Washington, and I'm 35 years old. I built my tech startup from absolutely nothing, just a kid from a middle-class family where both my parents were teachers. They taught me that if you work hard enough and smart enough, you can earn your place anywhere. By the time I was 30, my financial technology company was pulling in serious money. Not bragging, just setting the scene for what comes next. When I decided to buy a house, I didn't mess around. I found this beautiful gated community in Fort Lauderdale and paid $800,000 cash. No mortgage, no debt, just clean money from years of grinding, 18-hour days, building something real. But here's the thing about success. I've always been a car guy. Growing up, my dad had this old Camaro that barely ran, but on Sundays, we'd spend hours in the garage trying to fix it. He'd tell me, son, when you make it, buy yourself something beautiful. So I did. By the time I moved into Pine Grove Estates, I owned 6 cars, each one representing a milestone in my business journey. The Tesla was my first big contract, the BMW came after I hired my 10th employee, the Porsche was the day I hit my first $1 million in revenue. For me, these cars weren't just transportation, they were proof that the American dream still works if you're willing to put in the work. I had this routine every morning. I'd wake up, grab my coffee, and decide which car matched my mood for the day. Feeling electric and innovative? Tesla it is. Need to project serious business energy? The BMW would do the trick. Want to remind myself why I started this whole journey? The Porsche never failed to put a smile on my face. I'd rotate them in my driveway, keeping things fresh, making sure each one got some love. My garage could only fit 3 cars, so I'd always have 2 or 3 parked in my driveway. Perfectly legal according to the homeowner association rules, maximum of 4 vehicles visible, and I never exceeded 3. Pine Grove Estates was exactly what you'd expect from an $800,000 gated community. I'd guess about 90% of the residents were white, upper-middle-class families, doctors, lawyers, business owners, successful people who'd earned their way into this slice of paradise. I was one of maybe 3 black families in the entire community, but I didn't think much about it at first. Success speaks its own language, right? Or so I thought. That's where Linda Patterson comes into our story. Linda was 38, lived 3 houses down from me, and had apparently appointed herself as the unofficial neighborhood watch. I'm talking about the kind of person who notices everything. When you leave, when you come back, who visits you, what you're wearing, what you're driving. At first I thought she was just being friendly. She'd wave when I was washing my cars, occasionally comment about the weather, but there was something in the way she looked at my driveway that made me uncomfortable. It wasn't admiration, or even curiosity. It was more like she was calculating something. The first real incident happened on a Saturday morning in March. I was out there washing the Porsche, taking my time, enjoying the Florida sunshine. The car was gleaming, and I was feeling pretty good about life. That's when Linda walked over with her little designer dog that probably cost more than most people's cars. She stood there for a moment, watching me work, before she finally spoke up. "You know, Marcus," she said, and I could hear something in her tone that I didn't like. "Some of the neighbors have been commenting about all the fancy cars. It's just a lot of showing off for a neighborhood like this." The way she said it, with that fake concerned smile, made my skin crawl, but I kept my cool. "Just enjoying the fruits of my labor, Linda," I replied, continuing to wash the car. "Nothing wrong with taking care of what you've worked for." She shrugged, but I caught the look she gave my driveway, like she was counting each car, making mental notes. I should have known right then that Linda was going to be a problem. But I'm an optimist by nature, and I figured she was just one of those people who needed time to get used to change. The community had been pretty quiet and homogeneous for years, and here I was with my rotating collection of luxury vehicles, changing up the aesthetic. I thought maybe she'd adjust, maybe even come to appreciate having a successful neighbor who took pride in his possessions. Boy, was I wrong about that. As I watched her walk away that day, her little dog trotting beside her, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. The parking lot behind our community had a small sign that read Thompson Property Management. Interesting. I made a mental note to look into that later, though. I had no idea how important that little detail would become. Looking back now, That Saturday morning conversation was the opening shot in what would become an all-out war. Linda had made her position clear. She didn't think my cars belonged in her neighborhood. What she didn't know was that I didn't just build my company by rolling over when people challenged me. I'd learned a long time ago that sometimes you have to fight for your place at the table. Linda was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Tuesday morning started like any other day until I opened my mailbox and found an official-looking letter waiting for me. The header read, Pine Grove Estates Homeowner Association Violation Notice, in bold, professional lettering. My coffee suddenly tasted bitter as I read the contents. The letter claimed that my excessive luxury vehicle display violated community standards and created concerns about property values. It demanded that I limit myself to one vehicle in the driveway and move the rest to my garage or face potential fines. The whole thing was signed by Linda Patterson, HOA president, in flowing script that looked like she'd practiced it. I stared at that letter for a long moment, feeling my blood pressure rise. HOA president? Since when? I'd bought my house just 8 months ago, and I'd read every single page of the homeowner association documents. I'm a detail guy. You don't build a successful tech company without being obsessive about the fine print. I remembered seeing something about an HOA, but it had seemed pretty minimal. Basic stuff about lawn maintenance and no commercial vehicles. Nothing about limiting the number of personal cars you could own or display. I grabbed my laptop and spent the next hour reviewing all the documents from my house purchase. After reading through everything twice, I had my answer. Pine Grove Estates technically had a homeowner association, but it had been dormant for years. The last elected president had moved away in 2021, and according to the bylaws, no new elections had been held. There was no current president, no active board, and definitely no authority for anyone to be sending out violation notices. Linda Patterson had given herself a title that didn't exist and was using it to harass her neighbors. I decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Eleanor Davis, the 72-year-old woman who lived next door to Linda. Mrs. Davis had been in the neighborhood for 30 years, and if anyone knew the real story about the HOA situation, it would be her. I found her in her front yard, tending to the most beautiful flower garden I'd ever seen. When she looked up at me, her eyes sparkled with the kind of wisdom that only comes from decades of watching neighborhood drama unfold. Mrs. Davis, I said, holding up the letter, I got this from Linda Patterson, claiming to be the HOA president. Do you know anything about that? She laughed. Actually laughed out loud and straightened up, brushing dirt off her gardening gloves. Oh, honey, that woman has been trying to run this neighborhood since her divorce finalized last year. She's not the president of anything except her own little fantasy. She invited me to sit on her front porch, in these old wooden chairs that she told me her late husband had built. Let me tell you something about Linda Patterson, Mrs. Davis continued, settling into her chair with a knowing smile. That girl tried to run for the Parent-Teacher Association at her kids' school and got voted down. Tried to organize a book club and couldn't get 3 people to show up. Now she's decided the HOA is her chance to finally be in charge of something. Her ex-husband was a successful doctor who left her for a younger woman, taking half the assets and most of the social standing she'd enjoyed. She sees your success, and it eats her alive. Some people get inspired by other people's achievements. Others get resentful. Linda's definitely in the second category. Armed with this information, I decided to confront Linda directly. I walked over to her house that evening, the fake violation notice in my hand. She answered the door wearing a bathrobe and an expression that suggested she wasn't thrilled to see me. Linda, I said, keeping my voice calm and professional, we need to talk about this letter you sent me. I held up the notice, watching her face carefully. For just a moment, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes before she composed herself. I represent the community's interests, Marcus, she said, crossing her arms defensively. We have standards to maintain here. The word standards came out with just enough emphasis to make her meaning clear. Interesting, I replied, pulling out my phone and opening the HOA documents I'd researched. Because according to these official bylaws, there is no current HOA president. The position has been vacant for over 2 years. I watched the color drain from her face as I continued. So either you were elected in some meeting I wasn't notified about, which would be a violation of the notice requirements, or you're just making things up as you go along. Linda's mouth opened and closed a few times like a fish out of water. I represent the community values, she stammered, but the confidence was gone from her voice. The neighbors are concerned about property values, about the kind of image we're projecting. The kind of image, I repeated, stepping closer. What kind of image would that be, Linda? She realized she'd said too much and tried to backtrack. I just mean that some vehicles are more appropriate for a family neighborhood than others, she said, but we both knew what she really meant. I folded the letter and put it in my pocket. "Here's what's going to happen," I said quietly. "You're going to stop sending fake official notices. You're going to stop claiming authority you don't have. And you're going to leave me and my legally parked vehicles alone. Because if you don't, I'm going to start documenting everything you do and say, and I guarantee you won't like how that story ends." As I walked away from her house, I could feel her eyes boring into my back. I'd called her bluff, and she didn't like it one bit. But instead of backing down like I'd hoped, I had a feeling Linda was about to escalate things. I was right. 3 weeks after my confrontation with Linda, I made the mistake that would push her over the edge. I bought my dream car, a brand new BMW M8 in midnight black with red leather interior. The thing was absolutely gorgeous, and I couldn't resist having it delivered right to my driveway on a Saturday morning when the whole neighborhood could see it. The delivery was quick and professional, and I spent the next hour just walking around the car, admiring every detail. It represented the biggest contract my company had ever landed, and I wanted to savor the moment. Several neighbors stopped by to congratulate me and check out the new addition, and it felt like one of those perfect moments where hard work pays off in a visible, tangible way. By lunchtime, I had rotated my cars so the new BMW sat prominently in the center of my driveway, flanked by the Tesla and the Range Rover. It looked like a luxury car showroom, and I'll admit I was enjoying the attention. It was one of those perfect moments where hard work pays off in a visible, tangible way that everyone can appreciate. Or so I thought. I was inside making lunch when I heard the sirens. 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of my house, their red and blue lights cutting through the afternoon sunshine. My heart sank as I realized what was happening. Through my window, I could see Linda standing across the street with her phone out, recording everything. The officers, one white, one Hispanic, approached my front door with the kind of professional caution that told me someone had painted me as potentially dangerous. I opened the door before they could knock, keeping my hands visible and my voice calm. "Good afternoon, officers. I'm Marcus Washington. This is my house. How can I help you?" The older officer, a sergeant with graying temples, looked genuinely uncomfortable as he explained why they were there. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity involving multiple expensive vehicles at this address. The caller was concerned about possible drug dealing or other illegal activity." The words hit me like a punch to the stomach. Drug dealing. Because a successful black man with nice cars couldn't possibly have earned them legitimately. I felt that familiar tightness in my chest that every successful person of color knows. The moment when you realize that no amount of achievement can protect you from other people's assumptions. "Officers," I said, walking slowly toward my driveway, "these are my cars. I own them legally, and I can provide registration and insurance documentation for every single one." I pulled out my phone and showed them photos of all my paperwork, which I'd digitized months ago, precisely because I knew this day might come. The younger officer seemed satisfied almost immediately, but his partner kept glancing across the street, where Linda was still recording. I explained my business, showed them my company website on my phone, and even pulled up recent news articles about our latest round of funding. The whole interaction took about 15 minutes, during which Linda maintained her position across the street, recording everything for whatever narrative she was planning to spin. When the officers finally left, they actually apologized for the inconvenience and suggested I might want to consider filing a complaint about false reports. I thanked them for their professionalism, but inside I was burning with anger and humiliation. My neighbors had watched police cars pull up to my house because someone had suggested I was a drug dealer. The message was clear. I didn't belong here, and Linda was going to keep pushing until everyone believed it. That evening, Mrs. Davis knocked on my door with a grim expression. "Baby," she said, "you need to see what that woman posted online." She handed me her tablet, and I felt my stomach drop as I read Linda's post. She'd titled it "Concerning Activity in Our Safe Neighborhood," and included edited video footage that made it look like I was being investigated for serious crimes. The text was carefully worded to avoid obvious lies, but the implication was she described a young man with multiple expensive vehicles and unusual activity patterns that had prompted concerned neighbors to contact law enforcement. The post had been shared in 3 different local community groups and already had over 100 comments. Reading those comments was like watching my reputation get shredded in real time. People who had never met me were speculating about everything from drug dealing to money laundering to gang activity. The racism was mostly coded, lots of talk about those people and changing neighborhood demographics, but the message was unmistakable. Linda had successfully planted the seed that a successful black man with nice cars must be up to something illegal. Several commenters mentioned that they'd drive by my house to keep an eye on things, which felt like barely veiled threats. I spent that night documenting everything, screenshots of the post and every comment, timestamps, usernames, everything I could preserve as evidence. I also set up a more sophisticated security system around my property, with cameras that could capture both video and audio from multiple angles. If Linda wanted to play games, I was going to make sure I had a record of every move she made. Mrs. Davis had warned me that Linda had run off 2 other families in the past 3 years using similar tactics. The Johnsons, a young black couple who'd moved out after months of harassment and complaints. The Garcias, a Hispanic family who'd left after someone kept calling immigration services on them despite their being American citizens for 3 generations. As I watched Linda's posts gain traction online, I realized this was bigger than just one bitter woman. This was about power, control, and the belief that certain people belonged in certain places while others didn't. Linda had weaponized social media and the criminal justice system to try to drive me out, banking on the assumption that I'd eventually get tired of fighting and just leave. What she didn't understand was that I'd built my entire career on solving problems that other people thought were impossible. Linda Patterson was about to become just another business challenge I needed to overcome, and I had some ideas about how to do exactly that. I woke up Thursday morning to find $15,000 worth of damage done to my Porsche. Someone had carved the word "leave" deep into the driver's side door, scratching all the way down to the metal. I stood there in my driveway, coffee mug forgotten in my hand, staring at the destruction and feeling something dark and cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was escalation to property destruction, and whoever did it wanted me to know that they could reach me whenever they wanted. The security footage told the story clearly. At 2:37 in the morning, a figure in a dark hoodie had crept across my driveway and spent nearly 5 minutes methodically destroying my car. The person kept their face hidden, but I could tell from their size and build that it was probably a teenager. More importantly, the timestamp showed that Linda's bedroom light had been on during the entire incident, and her front door had opened twice, once right before the vandalism started and once right after it ended. Coincidence? I seriously doubted it. I called the police to file a report, and this time they took me seriously. The responding officer was professional and thorough, documenting the damage and reviewing my security footage. "This is clearly targeted harassment," he said, handing me the case number. "Have you had any ongoing disputes with neighbors?" I told him about Linda's fake HOA letters and the false police report, watching his expression grow more serious as the pattern became clear. "You might want to consider getting a restraining order," he suggested. "This kind of thing usually escalates until someone puts a stop to it." But Linda wasn't done. 2 days later, she organized what she called an emergency neighborhood safety meeting and convinced 12 families to show up in the community clubhouse. I wasn't officially invited, but Mrs. Davis called to warn me. "That woman is telling everyone that you're bringing criminal elements into the neighborhood," she said, her voice tight with anger. "You need to get over here and defend yourself." I threw on a button-down shirt and headed to the clubhouse, knowing I was walking into a trap, but unable to let Linda's lies go unchallenged. The moment I walked into that room, the conversation stopped. 12 of my neighbors sat in folding chairs, and every single face turned toward me with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. Linda stood at the front like she was conducting a town hall meeting. "Marcus," she said with fake sweetness, "how good of you to join us. We were just discussing some community safety concerns." The way she emphasized the word safety made it clear that I was supposed to be the threat they were worried about. Linda launched into a prepared speech about changes in the neighborhood dynamic and unusual activity patterns that had residents worried about property values and family security. She never mentioned my name directly, but everyone in the room knew exactly who she was talking about. When she opened the floor for comments, I watched several of my neighbors voice concerns about those people moving into family neighborhoods and bringing urban problems with them. The racism was barely coded at this point. Finally, I had heard enough. I stood up slowly, letting the silence stretch until I had everyone's attention. "Linda," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge, "since we're talking about unusual activity, let's discuss the unusual activity of someone sending fake HOA violation notices, or filing false police reports, or organizing vigilante meetings to discuss residents you don't like." I pulled out my phone and showed them screenshots of Linda's social media posts and the documentation I'd been collecting. If we're worried about criminal behavior in this neighborhood, maybe we should start with harassment and property destruction. The room erupted in uncomfortable murmurs as people realized they'd been manipulated into attending what was essentially a lynch mob meeting disguised as community outreach. Several neighbors looked genuinely embarrassed, and two families actually got up and left without saying another word. But Linda wasn't backing down. "I'm just trying to protect our community," she said, and I swear I saw tears forming in her eyes. "All I want is for Pine Grove to remain the safe, family-friendly neighborhood it's always been." "Safe for who?" I asked, and the question hung in the air like smoke. Safe for families like mine who pay their mortgages on time and follow all the rules, or only safe for families who look like you? Mrs. Davis chose that moment to speak up from her seat in the back row. "Linda Patterson," she said in a voice that could cut glass, "you've been stirring up trouble ever since your divorce, and now you're trying to drag the rest of us into your personal vendetta." The room fell silent as Mrs. Davis continued. "That parking lot behind us? It's not owned by the city or any HOA, sweetie. It belongs to Dave Thompson's little company, and he's been struggling since his wife left him." That single sentence changed everything. A parking lot owned by a private company, not the municipality or the homeowner association. My business brain immediately started calculating possibilities while I maintained my poker face. If the parking lot was privately owned, that meant it could be bought. And if it could be bought, that opened up some very interesting opportunities for someone with enough cash and the right motivation. I thanked Mrs. Davis for the information and excused myself from the meeting, leaving Linda to face the increasingly skeptical questions from neighbors who were finally starting to see through her manipulation. That night, someone let the air out of all four tires on my Range Rover and poured brake fluid on the driveway underneath it. The message was clear. The harassment was going to continue until I gave up and moved away. But as I stood there looking at the damage, I wasn't thinking about moving anymore. I was thinking about Mrs. Davis's comment about Thompson Property Management and wondering just how much Dave Thompson might want for his struggling little business. I spent the next 3 days researching everything I could find about Dave Thompson and his property management company. Public records showed that Thompson Property Management was a small operation that handled parking and basic maintenance for several gated communities in South Florida. The business had done well initially, but the past 2 years had been rough. COVID hit his commercial clients hard, then his divorce had cost him half his assets, and now he was struggling to keep the business afloat. The parking lot behind Pine Grove Estates was actually his most stable contract, bringing in about $4,000 per month from the 60 families who rented spots. I found his business listing online and decided to approach this like any other acquisition opportunity my company might consider. On Wednesday morning, I called his office and introduced myself as a local entrepreneur interested in discussing potential investment opportunities in the property management sector. Dave Thompson turned out to be exactly what I'd expected. A 45-year-old guy who sounded exhausted by life but still maintained the hopeful tone of someone trying to make things work. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop in downtown Fort Lauderdale the next day. When Dave walked in, I could see the stress written all over his face. He looked like a man who'd been fighting uphill battles for too long. We shook hands and ordered coffee, making small talk about the weather and the local business climate while we sized each other up. Finally, I cut to the chase. "Dave," I said, leaning forward slightly, "I'm going to be direct with you because I think we can help each other out. I'm interested in acquiring your company, and I'm prepared to make an offer that would solve your immediate financial problems while keeping you on as the operational manager." The expression on his face was priceless. Surprise, suspicion, and desperate hope, all mixed together in equal measure. "You want to buy Thompson Property Management?" he asked, like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Can I ask why? It's not exactly a growth industry, and frankly, it's not worth much right now." I explained that I was diversifying my investment portfolio and looking for stable, cash-generating assets in the local real estate market. Not technically a lie, just not the complete truth. Dave didn't need to know about Linda Patterson or her harassment campaign. Over the next hour, Dave laid out the financial reality of his situation. Thompson Property Management was generating about $8,000 per month in revenue, but had overhead costs that ate up most of the profit. The Pine Grove contract was his bread and butter, but he also handled 3 smaller developments that barely broke even. "The divorce wiped me out," he admitted. "My ex-wife got the house, half the business assets, and I'm basically starting over at 45 with nothing but debt and a handful of contracts that barely pay the bills." "What if I offered you $400,000 for the entire company?" I asked, watching his face carefully. "Cash purchase, close within 2 weeks, and you stay on as general manager at $75,000 per year plus benefits." Dave nearly choked on his coffee. 400,000? He repeated, like he wanted to make sure he'd heard correctly. For a company that's barely worth 200 on paper? I nodded. I'm paying for the established relationships, the contracts, and the operational expertise. Plus, I believe there's growth potential that you haven't been able to capitalize on due to capital constraints. The truth was simpler than my business explanation. $400,000 was nothing compared to the satisfaction I'd get from owning the parking lot where Linda and all her petition-signing neighbors parked their cars every day. This wasn't just an investment. This was the foundation for the most elegant revenge I could imagine. Dave Thompson was getting a lifeline that would save his business and his financial future. I was getting the power to control something that every single person in Pine Grove Estates took for granted. We shook hands on our preliminary agreement, and Dave looked like a man who'd just been thrown a life preserver in rough seas. "You're saving my ass, man," he said, genuine gratitude in his voice. "These people don't know how good they had it with me barely scraping by. Wait until they see what professional management really looks like." I smiled and told him we'd have lawyers draw up the papers by Friday. Dave had no idea he was about to become my partner in the sweetest revenge scheme ever conceived. While Dave and I were finalizing our handshake deal, Linda was busy escalating her harassment campaign to new levels. Mrs. Davis called that afternoon to warn me that Linda had spent the morning going door to door with a petition titled, "Remove Problem Resident from Community." She was telling people that my presence was driving down property values and creating safety concerns for families with children. Apparently, she'd managed to collect signatures from 36 out of 60 households, more than enough, she claimed, to force me out of the neighborhood through community pressure. "She's planning some kind of big meeting for this Saturday," Mrs. Davis explained, her voice tight with disgust. "Calling it an official HOA meeting, even though we both know there's no such thing. She wants to present the petition and hold a vote to basically ostracize you socially until you decide to move somewhere else." The irony was delicious. Linda was planning her big power play for Saturday morning, completely unaware that by Friday afternoon, I'd own the ground that every petition signer parked their car on. I spent Thursday and Friday finalizing the paperwork with Dave Thompson, coordinating with lawyers and accountants to make sure everything was legally bulletproof. By 4 o'clock Friday afternoon, Thompson Property Management belonged to me, and I was officially the landlord for the Pine Grove Estates parking lot. Linda Patterson had no idea that her world was about to change in a very dramatic way. Saturday was going to be absolutely epic. Friday evening, I celebrated my new acquisition with a quiet dinner and a glass of wine, knowing that Saturday morning was going to be absolutely epic. I'd spent the afternoon working with a local printing company to prepare new parking notices for every single car in the lot, and I'd arranged for a crew to post them at exactly 6 in the morning, 3 hours before Linda's big, official HOA meeting was scheduled to begin. The notices were professional, polite, and absolutely devastating for anyone who'd signed that petition. At exactly 6 a.m. Saturday, my crew went to work. Every car in the parking lot got a bright yellow notice under their windshield wiper, with the heading, "Important Notice, Change in Management." The notices explained that Thompson Property Management had been acquired by Washington Holdings LLC, my personal investment company, and that new parking policies would take effect immediately. Residents who had maintained respectful relationships with all neighbors would continue parking under existing terms. However, residents who had participated in harassment campaigns against fellow community members would face revised lease terms, including month-to-month agreements and adjusted rates reflecting current market values. Linda's car got a special notice. Hers was bright red instead of yellow, and it informed her that her parking privileges had been terminated effective immediately. I didn't have to wait long for the reaction. At 6:45, I was enjoying coffee on my front porch when I heard Linda's front door slam hard enough to rattle windows. She marched toward the parking lot in her bathrobe and slippers, clutching the red notice in her hand like it was contaminated. I watched through my security cameras as she stood next to her car, reading and rereading the notice with growing panic. She pulled out her phone and started making calls, her voice getting louder and more frantic with each conversation. By 7:15, she was screaming into her phone at someone, probably Dave Thompson, demanding to know what was happening and who was responsible. The rest of the neighborhood started waking up around 7:30, and the reaction was immediate and chaotic. People emerged from their houses in various states of dress, yellow notices in hand, clustering in small groups to compare what they'd received. The families who hadn't signed Linda's petition seemed relatively calm. Their notices assured them that nothing would change for respectful tenants. But the petition signers were clearly panicking as they realized their parking arrangements had just become significantly more expensive and much less secure. Mrs. Davis knocked on my door at 8:15, wearing the biggest smile I had seen from her since I'd moved to the neighborhood. "Baby," she said, holding up her yellow notice, "this says I've been assigned a premium parking spot right next to the mailboxes. Is that your doing?" I grinned and confirmed that yes, Mrs. Davis was getting the best parking spot in the lot as a reward for being the only neighbor brave enough to stand up to Linda's harassment campaign. "That woman is over there having a complete meltdown," Mrs. Davis reported gleefully. "She's been calling everyone she can think of, trying to figure out who bought Dave's company. I don't think it's occurred to her yet that it might be you." Linda's official HOA meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the community clubhouse, and despite the chaos in the parking lot, she seemed determined to proceed with her plan. I could see her through my window, pacing back and forth in her driveway while talking on her phone, occasionally gesturing wildly at her car, and the red notice still stuck under her windshield wiper. At 8:45, she stormed back into her house and emerged 10 minutes later wearing a business suit. The woman was clearly planning to project authority and control even as her world crumbled around her. I arrived at the clubhouse precisely at 9:15, wearing a casual button-down shirt and carrying a manila folder full of official documents. The scene inside was exactly what I'd expected. About 20 neighbors sitting in folding chairs, their yellow and red notices spread across the table in front of them, while Linda stood at the front of the room trying to maintain order. She was in the middle of explaining her petition when I walked in, and the conversation stopped dead as every head turned toward me. "Sorry I'm late," I said cheerfully, taking an empty seat in the back row. "Please continue with your presentation, Linda. I'm very interested to hear about this petition you've been circulating." The color drained from her face as she realized I somehow knew about her door-to-door campaign, but she pressed forward with her planned speech. For the next 5 minutes, Linda explained how she'd collected 36 signatures requesting my removal from the community, and how she believed the majority should have the power to determine who belonged in Pine Grove Estates and who didn't. When she finished, I stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room, opening my manila folder as I moved. "That's a fascinating presentation, Linda," I said, pulling out the first document. "But before we talk about removing anyone from the community, I think we should discuss some changes in our parking arrangements. You see, Thompson Property Management was sold yesterday afternoon. I held up the signed purchase agreement, letting everyone see the official seals and signatures. The new owner has decided to implement some policy changes based on community behavior patterns over the past few months." The room erupted in confused murmurs as people started connecting the dots. Linda's face went completely white as she stared at the documents in my hands. "You bought Dave's company?" she whispered, like she couldn't quite process what she was hearing. "That's right," I confirmed, pulling out a second document. "And as the new owner of your parking lot, I've decided that residents who participate in harassment campaigns against their neighbors represent a liability that needs to be managed through appropriate lease terms." I explained the new parking policies clearly and professionally. Respectful residents would continue parking under their existing arrangements. Petition signers would face month-to-month leases at market rates, approximately 60% higher than what they'd been paying. Linda Patterson was banned permanently. The tow truck was already on standby to remove her vehicle if she didn't comply voluntarily. As I spoke, I watched the faces around the room cycling through shock, anger, fear, and grudging respect. These people had just learned a very expensive lesson about the consequences of letting someone else's prejudices drive their decisions. Linda's meltdown was spectacular and immediate. "This is illegal," she screamed, her composure finally cracking completely. "You can't just buy our parking lot and change everything." I smiled calmly and showed her the legal documents. "Actually, Linda, this is exactly how capitalism works. Welcome to the free market." What happened next was the most satisfying moment of my entire adult life. Linda Patterson, the woman who had spent months trying to destroy my reputation, called the police on me for the crime of being successful while black, organized harassment campaigns against me, and vandalized my property. Completely lost her mind in front of 20 of our neighbors. "This is America!" she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "You people can't just come into our neighborhoods and take over everything." The words hung in the air like poison gas, and I watched as several of my neighbors visibly cringed at the naked racism that Linda had finally let slip out. "You people," I repeated quietly, letting the phrase echo in the sudden silence. "That's interesting word choice, Linda. Very revealing." Mrs. Davis stood up from her chair in the back row, her 72-year-old frame radiating more dignity than Linda had shown in months. "There it is," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. There's the real Linda Patterson, everyone. Now you all know what this was really about. I maintained my calm, professional demeanor, even as Linda continued her meltdown. For the record, I said, addressing the room rather than Linda directly, this is exactly how legal business transactions work in America. A privately owned company was sold to a new owner who implemented updated policies based on tenant behavior. I turned to look directly at Linda, who was now shaking with rage and humiliation. As for you, Linda, you have exactly 15 minutes to remove your vehicle from my property before I have it towed. The choice is yours. Dave Thompson chose that moment to walk into the clubhouse, and his presence added the final layer of credibility to my position. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave said, looking around the room with a mixture of relief and satisfaction, I want to confirm that everything Mr. Washington has told you is completely accurate. Yesterday afternoon, I sold Thompson Property Management to Washington Holdings, LLC for $400,000 cash. Mr. Washington is now the legal owner of this parking facility, and he has every right to set whatever policies he chooses. Dave paused and looked directly at Linda. I also want to say that in the 15 years I've been managing this lot, I've never had an owner treat me with more respect or professionalism. The validation from Dave was devastating for Linda's position. Here was a white business owner, someone the community had trusted for 15 years, confirming that I'd acted completely within my legal rights and had even been generous in my treatment of existing tenants. Several neighbors who had signed Linda's petition were already approaching me with apologies, clearly recognizing that they'd been manipulated into participating in something much uglier than they'd realized. We had no idea she was lying about the HOA, said Janet Morrison from Pine Street. If we'd known this was really about harassment, we never would have signed that petition. But Linda wasn't done yet. As the reality of her situation sank in, she tried one final desperate play. This is targeted harassment, she shouted, pointing an accusatory finger at me. He bought this company just to get revenge on me. This is discrimination. I laughed. Actually laughed out loud at the sheer audacity of her claim. Linda, I said, still chuckling, you spent 3 months trying to drive me out of this neighborhood through fake authority, false police reports, social media smear campaigns, and property destruction, and you're calling my legal business acquisition harassment? I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through the screenshots I'd been collecting. Should we review the evidence? Your fake HOA violations? Your 911 call claiming I was a drug dealer? Your viral social media posts, the vandalism that happened right after your bedroom light was on at 2:30 in the morning? The room fell dead silent as I laid out the timeline of Linda's harassment campaign. By the time I finished, even Linda's few remaining supporters were looking at her with disgust and embarrassment. Time's up, Linda, I announced, checking my watch. Your 15 minutes are over. Right on cue, a professional towing truck rounded the corner and pulled into the parking lot. I'd arranged this timing perfectly, and the driver knew exactly which car to target. Linda ran outside, still screaming about lawsuits and discrimination, but there was nothing she could do as her white Honda Accord was efficiently hooked up and prepared for removal. The tow truck operator was completely professional, ignoring Linda's threats and tantrums while he secured her vehicle. Where am I supposed to park? Linda demanded, as if the universe owed her a solution to the problem she'd created for herself. The street, I replied simply, about 6 blocks that way where the free public parking begins. Or you could try one of the paid lots downtown. I hear they're very reasonable if you don't mind walking. The look of rage and humiliation on her face was worth every penny I'd spent on this acquisition. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Within a week, 4 families who had signed Linda's petition approached me with genuine apologies and requests to maintain their parking arrangements under the respectful tenant terms. I agreed, because my goal had never been to punish innocent people who'd been misled. My goal was to stop the harassment and establish clear consequences for behavior that crossed the line. 3 families decided to move out entirely, apparently uncomfortable with having a black neighbor who couldn't be intimidated or driven away. Their departure actually improved the neighborhood dynamics significantly. Property values in Pine Grove estates increased by 15% over the next 6 months, partly due to the professional parking management I implemented, and partly because word spread that this was a community where harassment and discrimination had real consequences. The story of Linda's comeuppance became local legend, shared in coffee shops and community groups throughout South Florida as an example of what happens when prejudice meets preparation. Mrs. Davis became my unofficial neighborhood consultant, helping me identify other small improvements that could benefit the community. We added better lighting in the parking area, installed security cameras for everyone's protection, and established a community bulletin board for legitimate announcements. No more fake HOA notices allowed. The transformation was remarkable. Pine Grove Estates went from being a community divided by one person's hatred to being a genuinely welcoming place, where success was celebrated rather than resented. Linda still lives 3 houses down from me. Every morning when I choose which car matches my mood for the day, I know that she'll eventually walk past my driveway carrying her groceries or her dry cleaning, making the 6-block trek from the free street parking to her house. Sometimes I wave. Sometimes I'm washing one of my cars when she passes, and I can see the mixture of rage and defeat in her eyes. She created this situation through her own choices, and now she gets to live with the consequences every single day. The moral of this story isn't about revenge. It's about preparation meeting opportunity when prejudice tries to destroy what you've built. Linda Patterson thought she could use my skin color against me, assuming that a successful black man with nice cars must be doing something illegal. She thought she could weaponize the community, the police, and social media to drive me away from a neighborhood where I belonged as much as anyone else. What she didn't count on was that the same intelligence and resources that built my business could be turned towards solving the Linda Patterson problem permanently and legally. I didn't destroy anyone. I just revealed who they really were, and then I made sure there were consequences for their choices. Sometimes that's exactly what justice looks like. And you know what? Linda still walks past my house every single day. Want to know what happened next? Hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, what would you have done in my situation?